Yeah, so I'm Adam Maltese. We are doing a project on failure, and so that's why we're having these meetings. And I'm in Indiana at Indiana University, and I guess my position's associate professor of science education.
I'm Roxana Haddad. I'm the Director of Math, Science, and Technology at the Center for College Access and Success at Northeastern Illinois University. But I work from Los Angeles. I am visiting Chicago right now, which is why I'm not in a prison. This is my parents' basement. And yeah, I'm working on a project of integrating computational thinking into makerspaces.
Cool.
I am Alice Anderson. I'm in St. Paul. I'm in Minneapolis, and I work at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And I am Adam's co-PI on this project.
Hey everybody, I'm Justin. Hopefully you can hear me. I am a doctoral candidate at Indiana University. So I've been there studying in the Instructional Systems Technology Department, doing a minor in Learning Sciences. So gotten connected with Kylie Pepler, and then Dr. Maltese is one of my committee members. I'm working on my dissertation, and I'm actually living in Idaho while I work on my dissertation. So I've been looking at some of the different maker spaces that are going on out here in the West as well. So yeah, really interested in kind of the student experience of what it's like being in a maker space, especially how they learn through failure and all that. So that's what I'm up to.
I'll jump in. My name is Jean Rue. I'm calling in from the Exploratorium of San Francisco, which is a museum that brings together the worlds of science and art. I am a senior researcher here working on several projects related to research practice partnerships, which in other words, tries to bridge that gap between educators and researchers to really jointly negotiate questions, data collection, data analysis. And my current two projects that I've been involved with are focusing on tinkering in after-school contexts. And so I'm really interested in how kids use the problem-solving processes and creative thinking in their tinkering work to really work through those failures and challenging moments and taking intellectual risks.
I'll jump in here. I'm David De Lima. I am a postdoc at UC Berkeley, and I have just started working on a research project where we are looking at failure in computer science. And failure in computer science is often called debugging. Debugging is the sort of captures the active response to problems in your code. And we are working on trying to build a sort of proactive culture of debugging among students who are really new to computer science.
I'll jump in. I'm Tamara Homeland Nelson. I'm at Washington State University in Vancouver, Washington. And my research is on the implementation of STEM education and how teachers are conceptualizing STEM education, and then eventually getting to how does that translate into classroom practice. We're still at the early phases of this.
Hi, I'm Lama Jaber, and I'm an assistant professor in science education at Florida State University. I'm very interested in this conversation because I'm curious how people navigate moments of uncertainty and how they come to experience a sense of feeling stuck with a sense of excitement rather than kind of intimidation, both as learners of science, but also when we think about teachers or pre-service teachers who I'm working with right now and how they learn to navigate and embrace those moments as opportunities.
It looks like that's everyone who's on the call right now. We may be joined by Amber Simpson, who is the other PI on this project and a professor with Adam at Indiana University. But so this is, I think, our third or maybe third hangout, I guess you could say. And this time we thought we'd ask David and Jean and Roxana to talk about their own projects, and specifically like where in your projects you're really seeing kids encounter failure. So I know that we have all talked to each other, but if you could share for others that, and maybe there's a story or a moment you want to share, I think it'd be helpful to give a little bit of background in the context in which your study or your setting is, and specifically the age group, because I know when Adam and Amber and I were thinking about our project, we were thinking, well, what age do we want to work with, and what age do we think that they might have the metacognitive skills to talk about what might be happening when they're in a making or designing activity, and be able to really think about what the experience was, how it relates to failure. And so we chose the ages 9 to 15 as our age range, so sort of 4th grade to 10th grade. I think that's in there. I was really embarrassed this past weekend when I was chatting with one of our volunteers at the Maker program that we have at the museum, and I was like, what grade is 15? And she was like 10th grade, and then I was like, wait, how old are you? And she was like 17. I was like, oh man, I'm like way old over here now. I guess just one thing that I wanted to share. So at the Science Museum, we've been collecting data on our floor activities that we call Play, Tinker, Make, which are open-ended making and designing activities on Saturday afternoons. And this weekend, I was chatting with a girl who had just made a cookie cutter out of a strip of wire. And we were talking through our protocol, and then I said, would you consider did you experience failure in any of the activity? And she said, no. And I said, okay, well, would you use any other words? And she said, how about a fixable accident? And so I just love that.
That's amazing. Oh my God.
I was like, and then I sort of followed up and I said, do you use that phrase? Like, have you used that phrase before? And she said, yeah, sometimes with my friends, I say, like, if you miss class or you fail something in school, like, don't worry, it's a fixable accident. And I was like, I have a lot to learn from you. So I'll just say, to start from, thinking about our project was really motivated by hearing from kids, right? So from hearing from kids in our age range, how they think about failure, what words they use, what's a failure, what's not a failure. And so that's what's motivating a lot. And so that instance is just one that I'll share, but we would love our panelists to talk a little bit about your project. And again, maybe if there's a moment or an instance that you feel like really typifies what you're seeing, or one that stands out because it's so remarkable, we'd love to hear that as a starting point. So anyone who wants to, David or Roxana or Jean, whoever wants to jump in first, go ahead.
I'll do it. I know it's always hard to be the first one, so so forgive me if I fail at this first foray into describing. So the age groups that I've been working with in this past year is with middle school students in an after-school making tinkering program, and then previous to that, looking at a high school program specifically for girls with a program called TechBridge. And so the differences in those contexts are that in the TechBridge program, it was a year-long meeting once a week program where in the beginning of the year, students learned how to use Arduino, which is a microcomputer that you can code, and LilyPad, which is a sewable version of that. And then in the second half of the year, they started designing projects of their own design and interest, sometimes researching stuff online, other people who've been using Arduino, but really just for inspiration for the things that they actually wanted to create. So things like one group of girls made a pair of shoes for the visually impaired that had sensors that would make a servo turn back and forth. So like make your shoe vibrate when something was within 10 feet of it. Or another pair of or group of 4 girls wanted to create this like interactive physical space that you would, when you're on the inside of, was lined with lights. It was a refrigerator box, cardboard box. So when you're on the inside, like the lights would light up when in reaction to sound. And on the outside of the box were copper strips of tape that when you touched them would play different notes along a scale. And so people on the outside could play music, while people on the inside could experience the lights flittering to the music. And so in contrast to the current context that I'm doing data collection analysis in, where kids have different tinkering projects that have been sort of R&D'd with the tinkering studio here at the museum, and also our experiments in the after-school space in collaboration with the after-school teachers. And so those are more like, here's an example of, for example, a cardboard automata. Let's dive in and create something of your own based on this idea. And so you'll see kids kind of going off on their own new ways of approaching that idea, or building something similar to what they've seen as an example. So I guess a story of working through failure that I've seen, and some of you have probably heard this story from me before, but I was kind of impressed by this one group of girls that at TechBridge, where they were trying to create an alarm clock that became progressively more annoying the more you push the sleep button. And so in order to do this using Arduino, they wanted to use a wave shield, which would help with the audio. And so they were having to solder points on this wave shield that were these very tiny points of solder. And anyway, they did this the first time, it didn't work. The second time they tried to plug it into the Arduino, it still wasn't working. The third time, the fourth time, and then it was Maker Faire. And they were like, whatever, we're happy to show these 4 prototypes, none of which worked, at Maker Faire, where most people are showing things that work, and talk about our process. And I just thought that that was an amazing reflection of not, you know, like I try to think about failure or working through failure or persistence, not a personal trait, but as something that is a practice that can be a cultural practice that's supported through this, you know, this social group, like almost like a norm. And so I was thinking about like the girls, I think were willing to take and make those, take those risks and share that at Maker Faire. And I think they had a very cool social support in the cultural space they were working in, this after school program that made that possible. So just wanted to share that.
So Jean, any sense of how the other folks at the Maker Faire responded to these 4 examples of struggle?
Yeah, I think it was kind of cool because for Maker Faire that year, this was 2015, on their main website, so this is the San Mateo like flagship Maker Faire, and on the website for the San Mateo Maker Faire, they had like a Vimeo video interview with 2 guys talking about failure, you know, and working through failure. And it was very like, no offense to men, I love men, my husband is male, but it was like very manly, right? Like manly, working through failure, you know. And then here were these like girls that were like, there was nothing like masculine or gendered about their approach. They were just talking, you know, so it was just kind of like a neat contrast. And also, so in terms of response, like I think people really like, oh, cool, you know, like especially because the girls were so joyful about the way they were talking about it and welcoming, and they were like, they had their table, they were outside, you know, very visible, and just like, hey, we want to show you all of our soldering mistakes and how we got better at soldering, you know, like they didn't see it, and they were like, and this is what we would do next too, right? Like they had a vision for the future. So I think people were positive in response to that.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting point for me, which is the second part of the point I'll say first, which is this seems somewhat different than science fairs, which many of us are used to, right? Where like you wouldn't dare show all the failed attempts you had at, say, building a contraption or doing sort of, you know, bad trial runs of something. But it does also remind me of, at sort of a different level, but yet the same thing, there was a really interesting response to, I can't remember, I think it was at the New York Maker Faire or last year's San Francisco Maker Faire. but at the Google tent, they had a number of their prototypes for a couple of their products. And so I think for Google Glass or whatever, they had like from phase 1 or phase 0, which was literally Google Glass are the glasses with the camera and the high-tech stuff built in. The initial prototype was essentially like sport glasses taped with a camera on the side, right? So it looks absolutely like something that I could create, or that anyone could create. But then you could see sort of iteration after iteration as it got more high tech. Now, I think it's a little bit, I think people looking at that, it's cool to see these big companies show off some of their failures. And I think that's a good precedent. But I think it's different, right? Because people can laugh at that and know that there was still this fancy finished product that, thousands and thousands of hours went into, at the end of it. But I think really engaging other everyday people, including youth in this, takes a different tact. And I just wonder how, and it's not really a question, but just more of an open thought of like, would it be different if it wasn't at a maker fair? Because a maker fair in some way seems to me like the best sort of place for that sort of thing to happen. Because if anyone's done any making themselves, they get it and understand that, it's not like you do it once and it's perfect and it's beautiful and you're done with it and you move on.
I just posted a comment too, but I was just listening to Adam Savage and his Tested or Still Untitled podcast, and he was talking about this as he travels around now with the Nation of Makers and stuff, and seeing all these different maker spaces, and just how he was basically saying, I wish we could see more of the failed products on the wall. He'd love just like exactly like you were just saying, Gene, of here's steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 that didn't work and what ultimately led to it. And so, yeah, I think that there is, certainly some of that. And we, when I was there, helping to set up and work through and talk about and design the makerspace, we talked a lot about, having the clear bins and having the pegboard walls and not everything closed off so that people could see. And, and even when people would make 3D prints that didn't work, we wanted them to leave them there so that other people could see and get ideas. And yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Adam, that it is different than a science fair where you just are seeing the final polished product. And I think for many, many kids that's maybe why they don't resonate so much with the kids. Science fairs it's a different process for sure, I think.
It's interesting too. I was thinking about, this is something I still need to follow up with the girls. There's such strong, confident young women. And I wondered if, San Mateo Maker Fair, I think there's moves to make the space more diverse in terms of both racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, and gender-wise, because it's still a little bit more of a very it seems more like middle-class space, a bit more male-dominant, more whites and Asians than African-Americans and Latinos. And so I wondered if the girls perceived that at all, and if that felt at all threatening, or if, they felt like, whatever, I don't notice that, or, and it's something that I didn't really probe, but I think that the maker space totally is more share and tell and less competition-y, but I wonder if they felt any high stakes in terms of the audience they're presenting to.
Remind me, was this the high school girls?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because I had an interesting conversation with my colleague here, Keith Broadflat, who said, because I shared another example with a girl I had interviewed who was, I think she was 10 or 11. She was super confident and just no, I've never experienced failure in my life. Things were just not phased. And he kind of laughed and he's like, I've met that type before. I sometimes feel like there's this age of confidence that, especially, there's this sweet spot age range for girls where they maybe are just happy in their own skin, especially if they're, white and middle class or upper middle class and coming to the Science Museum, which is a comfortable space. And I mean, he was really referring to our summer camps, which are not very diverse in many ways. But it made me think about, okay, so what are the dispositions or the personalities that, how do we understand that and unpack that? So just something to continue in our conversation. And, I just put in this question here about like, what are the cultural practices or norms that support positive failure, or, that this is okay things. So maybe as, David and Roxana, you speak next, if you could, bring that up if you think of it. So, yeah. So David or Roxana, do you want to jump in and share about your space and your projects?
Sure. I'm happy to share a little bit about our project. We are also working with middle school students, and these are students who are from non-dominant communities in an urban environment, and so they're brand new to coding. And what we're trying to do is to build this debugging culture. And the types of failures that you see in code, broadly speaking, fall under two categories. There are syntax errors in code, which are almost just sort of grammatical errors. You sort of forget a parentheses, or you add an extra space, or you have a errant comma, that sort of thing. And then the second class of bugs or failure moments are meaning or semantic errors. And these are mistakes in logic. They're mistakes in sort of misunderstanding how the code flows, misunderstanding in some way, how you've defined a variable or how you've defined a function, and they're much harder to debug, that second category, because it involves sort of reflecting on your own thinking, looking carefully at how all of the code is working together, looking at the sort of sequence, the flow of code. And for that sort of second class, the first class, I think there are different sort of repertoires of supporting students, but I'll tell you a story of a student who had a sort of meaning error from a few weekends ago in the program. Essentially, this is in the context of programming a robot that moves around a grid and paints squares to produce art. And the robot was not moving at all in the right way, and it was painting squares that weren't sort of amounting to anything. And we had designed and the student was trying to correct this flaw in the program in a really haphazard way, sort of starting sometimes at the top of the code, other times moving into the middle or the end of the code. And it was a very minimal intervention, but I just suggested one thing, which is to use a stepper button, which steps you one line through the code at a time. And it just sort of slowed down the process, and you could see how each move the robot was making corresponded with each line of code. And the student was then quite simply able to isolate the problem spot in their code and come up with a really elegant solution for how that line of code should be rewritten. And I thought that was just a really nice intersection between the design of a software tool and maybe a very minimal approach from the instructor, and then how the student resolved their own dilemma. So Amber, I don't know if I have an answer to your question of what sort of cultural features create a positive, productive failure space. That's sort of something that I think we're working towards, but I definitely don't have an answer yet.
I don't think I do either, but I'll start talking anyway. We're interested in computational thinking, as I mentioned before, and how to work it, how to develop those kinds of skills through making. But specifically, we're trying to bridge the gap between informal and formal learning. We want this sort of thing to happen within the classroom, which is a little bit challenging, we're discovering, when you have 50 minutes. The failure thing it's tough to, for the wait time, for allowing for the struggle when you have to get a certain amount of content through to the students. So being a researcher, coming in and being like, this is really what I think should happen, and then reality is two totally different things I've learned. But I will, I'll talk about one teacher. I was not there at this observation, but I was going through that observation. I was reading the observation notes, and one of the teachers we've been observing, he gave the students a whole mess of stuff inside of a box, a battery, some wire, a light bulb, but also a balloon, a piece of cloth, a plastic rod, all sorts of things, and then told them to make a circuit. They told them to light up the light bulb. But he also put up on the board for the students, on the whiteboard, he put two sides, and the students were supposed to draw an example of when it worked, what they did. But on the other side, if it didn't work, they should also draw what didn't work on the other side of the board. So they were able to put, and the side with things that didn't work filled up quite quickly. Lots of kids were really thinking that a lot of stuff would happen with the balloon. They were rubbing it on their head like that. So they were able to draw that. But I was really impressed with when they are working under these kinds of constraints, coming up with solutions like that of teachers to celebrate failure, because they're putting up on the board what things don't work. And he's asking them to look at the patterns between them. Like, what do you see between these things that don't work? What can they tell us about what will work? Because all of that is data, all of that's information. And I mean, I guess that's kind of answering the culture question. Like, if you make your classroom or your place of learning a place that, and it sounds to me that David and Jean do this, like celebrate failure and, kind of highlight it. I feel like, and I think that comes from the top down. I think that's something, a teacher can do as well in their own teaching, as modeling it, but also making sure in every single activity, like what didn't work and why didn't it work? Because that's going to help us figure out what does work.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that I think that actually might be one of the most important things that has been said, or that has made me think about it in a while, in that we harp on this a lot, right, in science, that we talk about it, but I think we don't celebrate it in the sense that we tell students to make documentation, to document trials, what's happening, what the results are, but yet there seems to be this inherent belief of, I think, both on the teacher's side and the student side, of like, well, that didn't really work, I'm just going to sort of cover over that, and I'll only really document the stuff that does work. And I don't know if it's an attempt to look smarter or better or whatever, but good scientific practice is documenting all of that. And Amber and I have sort of pursued this with professional scientists and other STEM professionals. And just, even in casual conversation, they will tell you that, of course, most of science is failure. And so, right, like, even if you just take that notion that most of what scientists are documenting day in and day out around this country are things that didn't work, but that they still can learn from those things. And so, I mean, I think that is something that needs to be maybe thought about more, of whether it's an informal educator or classroom teacher or whomever it is, of saying, look, we talk about collecting evidence and data and using that to make decisions and arguments. This is data. It didn't work, but it's still data. And so, you've got to use that to make these decisions. And so sort of don't discount it. And if you actually give it value, then maybe students will start realizing that that's, a valuable thing.
That reminds me of a specific pedagogical move, exactly like you're describing, Adam, that I saw at Tech Bridge, where one of the after-school educators, in one of the first weeks of program, they were making their own journals and, decorating their own journals with paper circuits and LEDs. And she shared how right after undergrad, she worked in a biolab. And in that lab, she was required to write everything she did in a notebook, things that worked, things that didn't work, all of her projects, all of her experiments. And in the end, she was expected to leave that notebook there for the lab to use as a resource so other people could learn from her mistakes. And she talked about that as like, I thought it was a really nice way to frame the purpose of a journal, and that it was not just something just for you, like it could be something useful to others too. And then she proceeded to show her journal and how it had a non-working circuit on the front. And she was explaining that, she used a gumdrop LED that stuck out too much. And so after like a week, it broke off. And she was realizing it would have been better to use one of those flat ones. And she was like, and that was something I journaled about, and it's kind of like this moment of playing with that. So yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, so when I used to do field geology, it's actually a legal document, documenting what you have. And so you'd have to sign off on the pages. And if you made errors, you couldn't cross it out completely. You'd have to sort of just strike through and sign off and do those sorts of things. And I don't think, I don't think we necessarily want to go that far, but this notion of it is sort of a record, and that's an important record, I think is a good one.
Back to the celebration idea, it's reminding me of what I've read about, like the mathematics classrooms in Japan, where they pose problems, and then the students that don't get the right answer, they're asked to come to the board, and then they do their problems. And then the class as a whole work through as to like what went wrong and where, and they work with the student together as a class. And then once it's all figured out, everybody claps for the student that is at the front of the board. That student gets a round of applause. So I think stuff like that's kind of huge. That's a big way to say, like, look how your failure has helped you learn.
Yeah, I'll just sort of add a little bit to that. I don't think we've gotten very good yet at taking the wrong code and like making wrong code public. I don't quite know, it may be in like a common bugs page, or like watch out for these types of mistakes bugs. There's common sort of misconstruals of code. But what we are trying to do is, at the moment that something goes wrong, honor that moment and celebrate it by abstracting in some way what you did to get to resolve it, right? Like, what was the strategy you used to find the bug, to overcome it and get your code working again? And at that moment where you can describe your process, your debugging process, we sort of very excitedly ask students to write down that strategy in their journals. And we talk a lot about what these failure routines are like. So I think in some sense, we have further to go. We have a long way to go when it comes to just honoring the mistake itself. I think we're focusing a lot on the routine to debug. And I'm just sort of, I know both are important, and I'm not quite sure I understand what each one is doing, but I know we have a long way to go in the first.
I think we're also in our project thinking about at what point is failure anticipated or expected, maybe from either the maker or the facilitator. So, I'm watching kids at the Science Museum make little things. It's not preparing for Maker Faire. It's not presenting in front of a class. And so I'm not sure that I'm not even sure if they think of what they are, when things aren't working, I'm not sure that they're even thinking about it as a failure, because they just think about it as kind of the words you just used, David, like just part of the process, right? It's a mistake along the way, like another girl said, maybe she said, I messed up, but I could always fix it. So it's also figuring out, when do we use this word of failure, when does it feel like really appropriate, or where does it feel like, oh, let's not put the added pressure of like you failed because you couldn't, like this one girl was like, I couldn't get the hole to punch, so I failed. And I wanted to be like, girlfriend, like, just, it's fine. Like, you just get through it. You know, someone helped you. It's not a big deal. Then again, you know, if she considered that failure, that's not maybe the point at which we anticipated in the activity that there would be failure. And so is there a way that we construct the activity or the materials to not necessarily make that be a struggle point? So something that we've talked about is, you know, I think even in some of our conversations already here too, is like where should the struggle or where should the failure be a focal point, and when should there not be failure? So I'll go back to the cookie cutter activity. Like, I was surprised, I guess, to hear some of the facilitators say, you know, here are some options that you can make. The heart is the easiest. You know, so it was like, by the way, you should do the heart because it's the easiest. Like, it would just to communicate. There were a lot of hearts. And I just thought, is that really what, you know, I thought maybe the struggle was the making, the bending and the conceptualizing from your brain. What's the shape I want, or maybe I'm drawing the shape and then matching it. But if that's not the case, then maybe the struggle is punching a hole in the metal. So I don't know. I'm thinking through these as I'm observing. Love to hear other thoughts about that piece, where the struggle is idea.
I mean, I think, like, to me, it's kind of what David talked about with just if there's an opportunity for, I'm going to go back to like when Carol Dweck started writing about growth mindsets, and then growth mindsets blew up, and then she had to write this piece in Education Week, which was like, wait, everybody, you totally did not get what we're saying. It's not like keep trying, you'll get it, and then that's it. Like, that's not what I'm saying is, if it's, you know, if you're not getting through, then you've got to try a different strategy. Like, there's different, and I think it's in that looking for multiple ways to solve a problem that I think, you know, that's where the thing is like, if the failure is a demonstration of where you can use the strategy.
Roxana, I think your audio is there any way you're covering up your mic?
No, it could be my parents' basement. Oh, it's fine now? Okay, sorry. I don't know what happened. I don't know, what did you guys hear me say? Maybe
we missed the last 10, 15 seconds.
Okay. All I was saying was that I just think that that's where we can focus on in the failure is if it's an opportunity to think about different strategies or different ways to solve a problem. I think that's where the failure can be celebrated and noted, because that's what's going to help us find a different path or grow our own learning. When it's these other minor like things that aren't going to really give us those kind of demonstrations, then maybe it's not as useful to be noting the failure as much.
I'm wondering if I can ask a group question here, which is, I guess it's a rhetorical because I'm not going to actually give you guys a chance to respond to that. So the question I have is this notion of we've talked about it, and like I started off the conversation with, you know, a lot of people have very strong opinions about failure and introducing it to children and talking to children about it. And we definitely don't have a robust sample so that we can say what I'm about to say, but our general anecdotal conclusions, or at least what I've heard from, you know, the things that we've collected and from what I've seen and talked to people about, and sounds like from what other people are seeing, is that if it's not that kids really let failure roll off their back completely, it's at least that many kids don't seem to be being affected by these failures the way that adults think that they are. and I don't know if others would agree with that. Yeah, I guess I'm just throw it out there as what do other people think? Particularly in this, clearly there are stories of it affecting people, but at least in the making context, and maybe it's because it's not high stakes or something like that, but just wondering your thoughts and experiences in the groups that you've been working with or have worked with, if you've generally seen them just sort of roll with it and not consider it a big deal, or if it has been a real big deal, and if so, what are those circumstances?
So I'll jump in a little bit. I've been working with a first grade teacher who's taken this on in a pretty big way, and I haven't observed her classes. I've just seen the product of her kids' work and talked to the teacher quite a few times about it. And she says the kids, she can't believe how they persevere. They don't want to go out for recess. They want to keep working on it. They don't want to end it at the end of the day. They want to come back to it the next day. Like, they're doing things like trying to design a better house for the 3 little pigs, or save Fred who's drowning in a little puddle of water or something. And Fred's like a little frog or something. But she's amazed at, again, anecdotal, but she's amazed with how the kids will work together on solving problems as well. That kids who are typically having some issues in class tend to not have issues around this, that they are seeking each other's ideas or listening to each other. So I think it's fascinating. It's, I think there's a lot of potential here.
That's related to what I was thinking about too, Tamara. That's a really cool example, because I've also seen the moments of persistence involve a lot of really rich collaboration. And I've also seen where the failures result in kids getting really upset and giving up, moments where there's been poor collaboration. And so I think there's something there to explore more deeply in terms of sort of the pedagogical moves that are made to ensure that kids can feel comfortable turning to each other, supporting each other, working together. Because I definitely have seen a specific group of girls who, 2 of the girls formed a group, and then a 3rd girl joined. The first 2 girls were good friends, and then the 3rd girl was not part of their friend circle, but they were all in the same grade, and so she felt like they maybe would be okay working together. And it just was kind of awful where one of the girls was always alpha and kind of not having the computer screen position so the 3rd girl could see, these little kind of microaggressions that resulted in them not being able to work through the challenges that came up in their project, and not all of them showing up to Maker Faire and being excited about it. So yeah,
I think that somebody posted a question on the chat about what are the cultural practices and norms that support positive failure. And I know that Lam, I think, is the one working with pre-service teachers, and I do this more with pre-service and in-service teachers, and helping them, many of who have never done any kind of tinkering or makerspace kind of things. And we do an institute every summer, and one day is spent on the teachers being presented with a design challenge. And we try to focus not on the making, but just on the sort of defining the problem and having empathy for your client and understanding what the problem is. And they get very, very frustrated that our clients are trained to come back and say, well, that's not quite what I was thinking. I don't like that aspect of it. I really wanted this. And we find that the adults get both very frustrated, but this is a really good idea, just do it my way. And, but also by the end of this day, the reflections we get back from the teachers are like, oh my, I never thought about this before, how important it is to be open to new ideas and willing to change. And so I guess my point I'm trying to make is, when we're not doing this in an informal space like a science museum, where there isn't that expectation that you have to have the right answer, but in a classroom where we've built that culture of things need to be right and you do it one time, that helping the teachers understand that the time to try and test and get feedback and retry and redo it is really important. And it's a very much a cultural shift, and it's also a structural shift, because we don't have enough time in the year to all of a sudden now take 2 weeks on a design challenge.
I mean, I don't want to be, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just to follow up on the idea with working with, I think both in-service and pre-service teacher, one of the things I noticed in the context of science education and science learning is that many of them have not had opportunities among themselves to explore moments of not knowing really. And part of the challenge, I think, when I try to compare the dynamics of what we're discussing here to the context of science education, one thing on my mind is this notion of framing again, like science, the goals of science learning seem to be more directed towards achieving particular, like the outcome oriented, I guess, or knowledge driven more than process oriented. And so for the teachers themselves, this is how they have been doing it, and this is how they learned science for the most part. So if you think about them as the experience of feeling or being or doing like scientists, they have not had opportunities to do that. So I think this is where the role of creating at least like pockets of how that might look like and how that might feel for them in teacher education programs or pre-service teacher education program. I find it very powerful in moments where they pause to reflect and say, I've never had such an experience. And then thinking of how then I can create similar moments for my students become kind of a different orientation to their teaching, something that they're more conscious and intentional about, I think.
Yeah, Lama, you just took what I was about to say, that I think what I was going to say is I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but this is like a bigger problem in like a larger cultural problem, I think, in both education and in science. So we just don't see a lot of published science papers that are like, here's how everything went terribly wrong. Like that just doesn't, nobody publishes that. It should, but it just doesn't happen that often. It's not part of the scientific community culture. It's also not part of, I think, we'd all probably be in an agreement that teachers don't feel like they're in an environment right now where they can publicize how they've failed either. As teachers, they are, they need to feel safe in their profession, and I don't think they always get that. So I think these things kind of trickle down. If they're not seeing that in the scientific community, they're not seeing that as educators. It's tough for us to build models for our students to tell them, well, ignore all this, but we want something totally different for you.
Nodding enthusiastically over here, echoing what everyone said, and part of our project is going to be collecting data in 3 different spaces. So at the Science Museum, and an after-school setting, and then in a K-12 environment. And this conversation is making me think about, yes, we need to be collecting data from kids and the educators, but also we need to get a handle on what is that culture? What are the kind of structures in place that either reinforce or allow for openness? I think the Science Museum is a very open place. It's, and Keith, my colleague who runs the Maker program, is very explicit that the focus on the Maker activities that we have on the floor are about the experience, not about learning science or having a finished product. And so there's no expectation to achieve, I think that differs a little bit in some of our camps and other experiences where it's like, okay, you've come to camp to learn how to design a computer game in 15 hours. And so there's sort of an expectation of a end product and kind of tiptoes into more formal education. But just as we're talking, I'm thinking, okay, how do we get a handle on describing that bigger sort of cultural or systemic the norms that frame how kids and educators are operating within.
Well, and we even had a discussion, meaning our small failure group had a discussion last week about whether or not the parent interaction with their kids depends on how much there's sort of a clear outcome, or like, can they win at a given making challenge, like making a cookie cutter for a given design. You're essentially, it's a matching game, and so you're trying to get the metal to do what you want to make it look like the drawing that you've made or someone else has made. Whereas in, say, a Scribblebot or some other type of building activity, there's multiple solutions that clearly can achieve the same goal. And this is all based on really just one observation that I think Alice made of a parent really not interacting at all in terms of the Scribblebot, but seeing, I think, a little bit more interaction with the cookie cutter, and just sort of hypothesizing that maybe that has something to do with it, and that's something that we're going to be, I think, looking at as we move forward too.
Are there other people here who are working with family groups, or is it mostly just youth? No. Okay. It is really interesting, the parent interaction, not interaction. We have been thinking about how to code the videos we're collecting, and one of the codes we've thought about using is failure prevented, and it's totally when a hand comes in and takes it away or whatnot. And I'm a parent myself, and Adam and I have talked about this too, about that we always are what's the word you use? Sort of modulating the challenge for our kids, so I'm, can't fault parents for jumping in sometimes, but it again brings to mind, so what is the struggle, what is the experience for the kid, and what does collaboration truly look like between a child and an adult, when often there is a very different different range of expertise in an activity, and what can mutually beneficial collaboration look like in making projects between kids and parents. That's our next grant idea. There we go.
I was just going to say a little bit on that, building on Adam's point, and it was something that I think Tamara and Jean both hit on. I think, Tamara, you phrased it as like, there's a right answer and you only get one shot. And Adam was talking about the sort of task structure. Is there a known outcome? And I just it's kind of a cop-out to say this, but to say that like this experience is situated in the task structure and the tools that you're using, how much you've learned, who in Jean's case, like who you're working with in that moment and what relationship you have with those people, and how the community treats the end result or the process. And then maybe individual things like your sort of emotional dispositions or your sort of past experiences with failure. It seems to me these will create a nexus in different circumstances, and we might say, oh, this is a really relaxed, productive, process-oriented view of failure, or in other cases, a very difficult situation to deal with failure. And I just, as a sort of like broad sweeping statement that is not particularly helpful, but I think in some way correct, it's probably going to be situated along a whole bunch of factors. And maybe we can sort of start coming to understand what those factors are, and then see what a sort of specific experience is like.
Yeah, one thing I'll say from related to our call in December, when we had a couple formal educators on, is they all agreed that they I won't say they celebrate failure, but they at least embrace it and talk about it as a realistic part of what they do. And this evil notion of, or as one of my former professors said, the sort of the tyranny of content, right? That any teacher, anytime you ask them to do anything, it's typically time is the first excuse that will come. And it's a real, it's a real reason. It's not an excuse, but it makes me think that, I've talked about this with David Wells from the New York Hall of Science and with some other people around making in the real world and programming in the real world it is constrained by time and some of these things. You've got deadlines and those sorts of things, but in a lot of ways it's not, particularly for the hobbyist or something like that. It's not constrained, and you could essentially tinker away on stuff forever. But when we bring it into an informal environment, maybe it's constrained by how long the parent wants to stay around, or how your little brother wants to, how long that little kid wants to hang out there. Or in a formal environment, it's an educator's judgment of like how long we can spend doing this and still call it, moving forward in our curriculum. And so one of the things that they were saying, which struck me and I definitely sort of want to explore more, is just, are we being unrealistic in a number of these circumstances, saying we're going to run a 45-minute class on how to code in Scratch, or how to create this product, and no one in their right mind would say that you can sort of explore it, design something that's creative and innovative, and then iterate it many times within that time frame. And so is it, are we sort of I don't know, selling ourselves a lie in thinking that that's possible in a number of these educational contexts? And at least the folks that we had on in the December meeting, were very clear that no, it's absolutely a case that content loses out, and you have to drop content, like we always pitch, but you have to drop content and really allow time for this if you really want it to become part of the process, so to speak. And so that was really important. And like typically you'd see a lot of educators roll their eyes at that and say, yeah, where am I going to find that time? But I think it really comes down to sort of what you're valuing. And if you really value this notion of iteration and design, then you've got to do that.
Or at least perhaps if we want to, I'm learning these days to be more grounded in reality, I guess, which is sometimes we separate ourselves in the luxury we have to experiment with research and ideas that we are excited about. But perhaps like finding ways to compromise whereby at least that pocket, I'm calling it, or like, a pocket of an experience that kids can have in these classrooms, in these public school classrooms that are very much constrained by so many different things, like not only time, including how the teachers are worried and how they're being judged and all of that and what they're held accountable for. So at least like, how can we create pockets of such experiences where kids can feel for moments what that might look like? And that could be a very kind of empowering moment and transformative moment, even if we don't see its effect necessarily in one science classroom, or how they might, relate to it in the future and have an anchoring event or anchoring experience that they might be drawing from as learners in other moments, perhaps. But I do hear your point. And I'm hearing it much more nowadays, I feel like, when in interacting with teachers in their realities. So yeah, it's a challenge for sure.
Well, I think I'll take that sort of silent pause and say it's 9 o'clock. We should probably call it good here, unless anyone's got a real burning question. And I want to sort of thank everyone for participating as usual, and we will post. It's nice. I think we're sort of actually building some attention to this. I got an email from a librarian at Penn State saying, "Can you send me the archived recordings of this? A couple people here are interested." So, we'll sort of give this. What was the term at the beginning? We'll give this perfect fixable accident of a meeting, out to the greater community. And again, keep in touch. And if you want to talk more, a number of us, including, thank you, Jean, thank you, Roxana, thank you, David. We're in pretty frequent contact trying to keep our projects informed of each other so that we can sort of learn from the terms and the little sort of twists and turns that each of the projects are making. And so we'll be trying to do this again every 4 to 6 weeks. So, look for another email, and then please keep in touch if you've got questions or comments or anything like that. So
thanks all. Thanks, Adam.
all right, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.